A Georgia prosecutor officially dropped the historic racketeering case against President Trump and others for attempting to overturn the 2020 presidential election. I want to go right to CNN's Kara Scannell. What are you learning, Kara?
Good morning, Pam. Yeah, this new filing in from the prosecutor who had taken the place to look into the Fulton County investigation of Donald Trump and others has filed a motion with the court saying that they are not going to move forward with the case or dropping the charges. What he filed what's known as a nolle pros, and that means that in theory, because if the statute of limitations hasn't run out, a case could be refiled. But he attached to his filing about a 20-page statement explaining his rationales for why he did not think that they should move forward with this case. You'll remember this was the case that began with Donald Trump making the call to the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, urging him to find the votes. And then District Attorney Fani Willis brought this historic investigation and filed those racketeering charges against Donald Trump and dozens of others for interfering with the 2020 election. She was then disqualified from the case because of an undisclosed romantic relationship with another prosecutor. And that is how this case now fell into the hands earlier this month of a prosecutor who was assigned the job of trying to find someone to take on this case. He said that he couldn't because there were too many conflicts, and he took it on himself. Now we're seeing the results of that, and that is that he is saying that they are not going to move forward with this case. And he summarized it in part by saying that he made this decision by examining the case file, examining what the jury had been presented, and also considerations of the law. He says that, contesting an election is not unlawful, but and that is part of the reasons for why he decided not to move forward with the charges at this point. But again, this is a nolle pros filing, meaning that they're dropping the case right now. In theory, it could be revived if the statute of limitations doesn't run out. But of course, Donald Trump is still in office for another 3 years. Pam, this is the last of the criminal prosecutions that have been hanging over Donald Trump as he entered the White House. The only conviction that he faced out of the 4 indictments was the one in New York for the hush money payments, and that one he is appealing. Pam?
All right, Kara Scannell, thanks so much. I want to bring in former federal prosecutor and CNN senior legal analyst, Ellie. How significant is this?
Well, Pam, this means the Georgia case against Donald Trump is over. This means really all the criminal prosecutions against Donald Trump are over. Now, I just had a chance to quickly read some portions of the motion that this prosecutor put in. This prosecutor, Peter Skandalakis, is a 40-year career, non-political, non-partisan prosecutor. He lays out his credentials in the motion, and there's really 2 reasons that he says he's dropping the case. The first one is just a practical reason. He says there's no realistic constitutional way we're going to be able to try the sitting president of the United States, nor is there any realistic chance that when he gets done being president in early 2029, that we will be able to continue a prosecution. That part is technical and I believe correct. But separately, there is a sharp rebuke in here of the DA who charged this case, of Fani Willis. This prosecutor, Skandalakis, says this case never should have been charged in the state courts here in Georgia. He says it should have been charged, if at all, federally by the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., which it was. Now, to be clear, Pam, this prosecutor, Skandalakis, seems to think that Donald Trump's conduct was certainly serious and worrisome. He spends many pages laying it out. But he does say this was not appropriate for a state-level prosecution in Georgia. Never should have been charged in the first place, and now it's over.
I want to bring in our Kristen Holmes. She is live at the White House for us, I believe. Or no, she's not. She's in Florida. That would make sense because that's where the president is, in Palm Beach. Kristen, this was once seen as a grave threat to Donald Trump and his political future. And it's a really significant development.
It is, and when you go back and look at what the legal strategy was around Donald Trump, what his lawyers were trying to do, they wanted this result. I mean, you just heard Ellie talking about this idea that the practicality of charging a sitting president is part of why they threw this out. President Trump's team knew that this would take on a whole new meaning, that all of these lawsuits would take on a whole new meaning if he was in fact elected to be president again, and they were banking on that. So what you saw in the strategy from his lawyers was pushing this, delaying this, drawing this process out as long as they could to get through the election in November. And the result, what they had hoped for, is exactly what happened here. The idea that it would be unprecedented and likely untenable to charge a sitting U.S. president. So when you talk about what their strategy was at the time, we reported extensively on this, you're actually seeing it play out now, years later, after they were putting in this effort to try and drag this out as long as possible. Now, this, of course, was considered a grave threat. You could tell just by how angry President Trump was around this. He mentioned it several times on the campaign trail and for years leading up to that campaign, talking about how this call was a perfect call, that there were lawyers sitting in on this call, and that everybody agreed. Obviously, not everybody agreed. That was the basis for bringing this case, was this President Trump at the time asking for the government in Georgia, or the officials in Georgia, to find more votes for him. But it is interesting to see how this strategy ended up playing out. And of course, we have not heard from President Trump yet. He's currently on the golf course. I assume we'll have him weigh in. His team will weigh in. This is something that they expected would likely happen, but they've been watching closely. But, you know, with so many of these legal trials and tribulations that we saw President Trump dealing with in the year up to the election, this is a similar path that we've seen from most of them, which is just this kind of falling off. You've seen some of these cases ending, and now you have this prosecutor essentially ending this case against Trump.
And this one was seen as the more serious one in Trump's circle because it was a state case, right, Kristen, and therefore wouldn't be subjected to a pardon.
That's right. And that was something that they had focused intensely on. Now, the lawyers did believe that they had some wiggle room in this case just because of the RICO charges themselves, that it's very hard to actually charge a RICO case. And given the evidence that the lawyers had seen around Trump, there was some speculation that they might be able to work in this case and get Trump cleared at some point. However, that doesn't change the fact that it was incredibly significant, and they did believe that the prosecutor, Fani Willis, was going to throw everything she possibly could at this case and try and make it stick. Plus, President Trump doesn't have a lot of relationships. He does now, but at the time, he didn't have a lot of relationships with these Georgia officials, who many of whom felt burned by what happened in 2020 when it came to President Trump, and were willing to go on the record to testify. Many of them did, at least in front of the grand jury, and were likely to do so in a public trial if that actually is what happened. And that would not have been good for President Trump to have all of these Republican officials also testifying against him in this case. So there were a lot of concerns around this case in particular. I will say President Trump continued to bash and say things that were untrue about Fani Willis, trying to get her off the case, and ultimately, unrelated to that, unrelated to what he was saying at the time, she did end up having a conflict that put the entire case in peril. So that was something that we saw from President Trump, really trying to rake her across the coals in a very public way, as he does often try to do, which is, instead of actually trying a case in a courtroom, he wants to try a case in the court of public opinion. And we saw that a lot in this case in particular.
So just to take a step back, Ellie, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Donald Trump will not face any legal accountability at this point for those alleged efforts on election interference, right? I mean, this is the end of it.
Well, so he was charged criminally twice, federally and in the state. Neither of those will ever make it to trial. I mean, has he faced political accountability? I guess I'll leave that to our political experts. There was certainly the congressional hearings. We remember the summer of 2022, the January 6th committee, which made extensive findings that entered the public record. Whether that hurt or helped Donald Trump is sort of out of my area of expertise. He has been sued by various people for his involvement in January 6th, but none of those have resulted in a finding of liability, a civil finding against him. So with respect to the courts, No, he has not been held accountable for anything that he did in 2020. And politically, I think is a question that we'll continue to debate into the future.
There's always the legal aspect and there's the political aspect. But of course, even after all the allegations and everything and this was brought, he was an elected president for a second time. So worth emphasizing that. All right, Ellie Honig, Kristen Holmes, Kara Scannell, thank you so much.
Been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing.